to the Compassionate Cultures podcast. I'm Rebecca Hemmings, your host, and I am joined by a very special guest I'm very, very excited to speak to. His name is Kevin J Brazant, who is a scholar, activist, creative educator, and strategic leader in higher education. So Kevin brings bold thinking to everything that he does, from challenging institutional norms to co-creating inclusive learning experiences. Come on now. He's also the founder of Lounge Akademics. So this is a platform that uses storytelling, research, and consultancy to disrupt the way that organizations think, teach, and lead. So whether he's working with universities or companies, Kevin's mission is clear, which is to inspire cultural intelligence and to drive equity-focused change. Hello. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you. Wow, following that intro, wow, Rebecca, hashtag no pressure. Thank you. No, greatly appreciated. Bless you. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a really, really interesting pre-chat. And given your work in higher education in particular, I was so keen to speak to you because we do a lot of work in higher education, and I know that the research that you're doing, the work that you're doing is so relevant, so needed. So I just felt we had to take this time to let everybody know what it is you do and what's inside your brain. So from that initial chat, can you explain to our listeners what brought you to working to create more inclusive spaces in higher education?
Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah. So for me, actually, this has largely been born out of personal experience, first and foremost. Like many children, particularly those of African, Caribbean, or African heritage, we often had a bit of a struggle in higher education, particularly when it came to teaching and learning experiences in the classroom. Looking at modes of intelligence and what is seen as intelligence, and particularly through assessment processes as well. So for me, particularly within school and general education, it was a bit of a slog for me. So it was a bit of a challenge on multiple levels because I just found that the environment was never conducive for my learning. And what we're increasingly seeing at the moment is that as we consider other sorts of needs, such as educational learning needs, whether you look at students or young people or adults even have a specific learning difference like dyspraxia or dyslexia, this further adds to the challenges that may be present in the actual classroom. So me, started from a personal perspective, found education very difficult. And I think what I found outside of education, I was very fortunate to have two brilliant parents in the form of my mum and my dad who educated me in different ways and really gave me a thirst for learning. This was not picked up in the mainstream education system. This was through supplementary schools, the school movement, Saturday schools.
Yeah, remember those.
My mum's independent learning in sending me off to just learn.
And just, if you can just, I'm going to pause just there. For those who don't know what Saturday schools are, do you want to explain?
No, thank you for that. That's really helpful. So as part of the supplementary school movement, and obviously there was a movement that, I mean, we're talking coming back to the 80s now for me, being an 80s child, and growing up and attending secondary in the 90s, there was a real need to support or to really supplement what we weren't getting within the mainstream educational space. That was largely looking at themes of identity, looking at who we are, not this deficit notion of that we are slaves, and that, this deficit notion that was framed. So for me, the supplementary school movement was a way to really enhance what we were learning at school, but also had a very strong focus on identity and who we are. And in addition to that, it also complemented some of our core skills as well that we needed to develop in maths, English, literacy. So it complemented what happened in schools as well. But it was very much Afrocentric, very much was geared towards looking at our true history and lineage. And the queens that we are.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, as you're speaking, memories are flowing back for me of times when I went to Saturday schools and I was learning about various historical figures I'd never known about. such as Marcus Garvey, for instance.
Yeah,
Within
100%.
it never learns about people like him within school. And then when we did do our math sessions, there was a level of patience that I didn't quite experience. I mean, you know what? I could go on, but I'm just saying I have those memories, and it was such a formative part of my youth that helped to form my identity in that sense of belonging.
The
Yeah.
nostalgia, I hear you. Yeah.
So you know, again, when we spoke, you spoke quite passionately about the awarding gap and your desire to, you know, bring that down through your work. For those people who don't know what the awarding gap is, can you explain?
No, definitely. So, to be honest, the awarding gap for me, that is a term that's often very specifically related to higher education, which is where I'm situated. But
Yeah.
actually, you may hear other phrases like the attainment gap, which is
Yes.
more or less the same thing, but often refers to statutory school education. In
Mm-hmm.
short, what it is that you often find that, and I hate the use of the term, the acronym political term of BAME, but usually anyone who is non-white, you often find that in comparison to their white counterparts, when it comes to leaving particularly education and even higher education with good degrees or good marks, i.e. your A's, your A stars, your first class, your 2 1s,
Yeah.
as degree classifications, you find that black students compared to their white counterparts, often there is a gap that exists because they're not progressing and achieving at the same rate as their white counterparts. Hence, the gap that exists between white students and everyone else. And it varies at the moment in the sector. The loose rule of thumb is that you're looking at usually between 20 to 25% in terms of that gap between black students that start with their white counterparts and then leave with a good degree, which is considered to be a 2 1 or a first. But it varies from institution, but that's generally an issue across the sector.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to know that, you know, universities are quite aware of these awarding gaps, and hence the reason why you have the race equality charter, which, you know, some universities that, you know, they're working towards making sure that you know those numbers are reduced. But your work, you have a framework,
Yeah,
disrupt the
yeah,
discourse.
yeah.
So this is, you know, what you say was born out of a deep engagement with students and staff in an attempt to reduce those numbers. Can you walk through what it is, how it works, and what kind of impact you hope it will have?
Yeah, no, definitely. Thanks, Rebecca. So, the disrupt the discourse framework, really, in a way, as I said at the beginning of our talk and our conversation today, it was born out of personal experience, personal frustration, and the need to really look at creative and active ways of learning. And that's what really worked for me. Recognizing that from a personal point of view, I kind of accidentally fell into higher education learning because my background was traditionally in film and media. So I came from a creative background,
Yeah.
but always storytelling, film, um, kind of more accessible ways of learning and sharing information was always at my fingertips. I always used it in wherever I went, however small or big. And that translated into producing this framework. I became very interested in pedagogy, in particular, how we teach and facilitate learning. And really, what the Disrupt the Discourse framework is it's an ongoing portfolio of research that I'm building, which speaks to how we recognize some of the challenges that I've outlined a bit earlier for students in our education, and how we can really disrupt how we talk about facilitating learning and actually learning in that environment, hence disrupt the discourse. And what the framework does really, it's more of a, as opposed to a specific methodology or method, it's more of a loose approach to how we may think about facilitating our learning. So it's a 7-step kind of framework, really, which it's not linear, it's presented in a linear way so people
Right.
can get it. But
Yeah.
ultimately, learning is very messy. Nothing
Yes.
happens in a linear fashion, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So with that, what the program does, or what the actual framework does, is it looks at disruption as a learning tool, first and foremost. So how do we disrupt in a positive way? And that means moving beyond death by PowerPoint, because some
Yeah.
lecturers love to do this PowerPoint thing. That's not conducive with people that may have
Yeah.
certain needs in terms
Yeah.
of accessibility, for example.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we look at disruption where we bring in things like activities that cause, to some extent, discomfort, that
Mm.
encourages criticality. And when we talk about discomfort, we're talking about the kind of discomfort that promotes growth. Where,
Right.
when you first encounter something that is new and you feel that
Mm.
pain of going through
Mm.
that process, of
Mm.
learning how to really step up to the task that you're being
Mm.
asked to do, it's really
Mm.
looking at where people feel stretched and there's growth as
Oh,
part of that.
I
And
love it. Love
and
it.
and beyond that, there's so many different aspects of the framework as well, and we could be here
Mm.
forever talking
Hmm.
about the great details. But what I'll definitely say is that it's really around turning what I would call monologic teaching, and just
Hmm.
so people get what I mean by that,
Yeah.
it moves from this transactional sense of I am the sage on the stage.
Yeah.
I know everything, and I'm going to
Hmm.
tell you what
Oh
you
my
need to
gosh.
know on the
Yeah.
basis that you know nothing, which is right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Obviously, we know that everyone has lived experiences. People
Hmm.
come with stuff personally and professionally
Hmm.
that they've learned and
Mm.
developed. And for me, the framework is about how we integrate that as part of our teaching and learning experience for students. So it's personalized and they see themselves not just in representation in terms
Mm.
of at the front of the room teaching, but also
Hmm.
within the context of how they see themselves actually a part of applying what
Yes.
they learn into their personal sphere of reference, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And what I'm thinking of is just fireworks are going off in my stomach, because I can really relate to bringing creativity into the teaching environment. I don't know if I've shared this with you, but we started out as a theatre and education company. So
Oh wow,
we also bring in creativity
brilliant.
into our training. And what we find is that a lot of people often, and this is not about us, I'm just saying how I
Mm.
can relate to what you're saying, is that we often find that people are quite surprised and refreshed by the fact that we're asking them lots of questions, challenging questions, where sometimes they're confused, but they have to figure it out, and eventually they get to that point. And so I totally am on board with this idea of reconfiguring, distorting, what did you call it, disrupting,
Disrupting, yeah.
yeah, how teaching happens. Because as you say, people learn in different ways, and we learn this as lecturers, right? When you're first learning how to teach, you learn that there are different learning needs. So why have we opted for one way generally of doing things? So I'm going to move you on.
Sure.
So yeah, what keeps coming up in these conversations is this idea that as Black and brown people, we take on the burden of all of this,
Yeah, yeah,
unfortunately. And
yeah.
so you've mentioned the emotional toll and the disproportionate labor that's placed on us, or on Black and brown students, to fix institutional problems that they didn't even create. So how can universities and other organizations readdress this imbalance more ethically?
I think for me, a key aspect to this is really looking at, first and foremost, we have to hold a mirror up to our institutions and look at the
Mhm.
cultures and some of the colonial legacies,
Yeah.
the systems of oppression that we uphold in
Mm.
terms of our systems, and we have to be very honest about that. Okay,
Yeah.
so first and foremost, I think we need to have a culture check of the institutions, and there's
Mm.
many ways that we can do that through
Mm.
CPD, staff training, uh,
Mm.
further independent learning, and all of that great stuff that can help to do that. But equally, we also have to recognize some of the damage that this has done to people as well,
Yeah.
particularly
Yeah.
Black and brown folk. And we
Mm.
need to have trauma-informed approaches
Yeah.
when looking at expecting colleagues, particularly people that look like myself and you, Rebecca,
Mm.
to
Mm.
kind of really carry this work and the
Mm.
toll that it takes, particularly when you are encountering resistance from
Yeah.
people that do
Yeah.
not want to shift in mindset,
Mhm.
when you're encountering people that have a level of ignorance as
Mm.
part of their work as well, who do not wish to acknowledge that sometimes these issues exist and,
Mm.
and are further oppressive. But also, we need to think about how ultimately, students are impacted by this as well as part of their
Yeah.
learning journey. So
Yeah.
for me, I'm a strong advocate for how we do our learning. Learning needs to be transformative. I'm aware of the fact that also we have to bring colleagues along with us on
Mhm.
the
Yeah.
journey. It can't be we can't be waving the big stick to beat people into submission and to feel that they're sent on a guilt trip. And
Mm,
we often get the opposite effects of this. But
mm,
for me, it's very much about being active, being open to looking at things differently. But
yeah,
this needs to be centrally from leadership. Leadership needs to
yeah,
demonstrate this because
yeah.
often what happens in certain circumstances in companies with HR, there are certain places where people are expected to engage with this work. Um,
Mm,
and it's done in silos,
yeah,
little pockets, when
yeah,
it needs to be seamless across the institution
yeah,
and
absolutely.
leadership led. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, no, go for it.
I know again what's going through my mind is what you say about having a trauma informed approach, and unfortunately, what I see in most organisations that we work in is there is a lack of awareness, and if I'm being very honest, a desire to be aware of the trauma that racism in its many forms causes. And I'm yet to find an organisation that has a racial safeguarding policy. We
Mm.
have it for other forms of abuse, which racial is, whether racism is, whether it's intentional or not. And I guess I'm saying this because I just want to keep repeating the fact that organizations do not have this. And so therefore, we are left to deal with the aftermath of that. And if there's something that I could recommend to people on that point, is just to simply read if you just Google Shelley P. Harrell's six racial stressors. There are six forms of racial stressors. So
Mhm.
there's lots of ways in which we can be traumatized and stressed due to different types of racism. That's what I'm going to say on that one.
Yeah.
But going back to your your what you were saying about leaders being involved in the process, absolutely important.
Mm.
And co-creation is a key part of the
Yes.
work that you do, both in research and in practice. So what does co-creation look like to you, and how can organizations do it in a way that's genuine and authentic?
Yeah, thanks. That's yeah, great point. So, yes, co-creation, I think for me, when we're looking at approaches to creating more inclusive environments, we do need to think very much about how we co-create those environments with people, from the way that we facilitate learning or training to our materials that we produce to the intended outcomes. And for me, as part of my work, co-creation has largely been looked at having that flat line in terms of that whole dialogue between um, facilitator and student or trainee or participant. And
Mm,
really from that, that's from the outset, from first and foremost, having a real understanding of who's in your room, okay?
mm,
Who's in the classroom, who's with you, and as part of that process, unpicking what people's motivations are, because regardless of what you're delivering, people are there, whether they had been dragged there kicking and screaming by their
yeah,
employers because they've been
mm,
mandated to do it, or whether or
mm,
not this is a voluntary interest to them. We
mm,
need to assess where people are at as part of that, in
mm.
terms of their motivations. So for me, as part of co-creation, it's really about checking in with people's hopes and
Yeah,
aspirations and
yeah,
expectations
yeah.
around our training,
Mhm.
what we create. And as part of that process as well, it's about creating environments that are experiential,
Yeah,
where we can take risks. Because
yeah.
with co-creation, there is an element of risk. There is an
Mhm,
expectation that, there are outcomes that we intend to have. There
mhm.
are outputs we may want to produce, but sometimes, we like to have control of that
Mm,
process. And
yeah.
really, co-creation is around I can't even pronounce it, giving up, but
Mhm,
relinquishing, that's the word I was looking for,
mhm.
our control around
Yeah.
that process and sitting with the uncertainty that things may not always go the way that we intended it to. But
Yeah.
if we're committed to the process, co-creation can bring some really transformative results.
But
Um,
sorry if I could just jump in there, because I'm thinking again, this is where you get the clash between the traditional colonial
yeah,
teaching system and what you're trying to communicate with organizations. Because there is this idea that you have this one holy person at the front of the classroom who controls
Mm.
every single aspect of it. But you're saying, well, actually, no, that's not quite working.
No. 100%. And we're seeing this through my own research and through the data. The data is consistently saying to us that, um, for whatever reasons, these assessment practices, particularly in higher education, is flawed. And I know
Mm,
your audience is primarily, obviously, we're looking at corporations, we're looking at organizations that, obviously work within professional capacities. But I think this translates equally to our
mm,
learning and development, yeah,
mhm,
and how we
mhm,
facilitate those sessions, and we're looking at training. So we have to really think about how we assess people. And I mean, I would encourage your listeners to really go off and check out Howard Gardner's work around multiple intelligences, okay?
mm,
Because in the UK westernized context, we often look at a very narrow one track way of assessing intelligence, right?
mm,
Intelligence can be embodied, it could be through movement, it could be through music. There
mm,
are other forms of creative ways in which we can engage with the learning process and how we
mm,
assess people's learning. So, for example, I introduce ideas like the sense of using podcasting as part of assessments to co-create learning and digital co-creation.
mm.
I think about elements of how we can use, sketchbooks,
Yes.
performance, poetry, all
Yeah.
sorts of ways that we can engage
Mm-hmm.
with things that we're learning, new concepts, and
Mm-hmm.
really to help, I guess, consolidate our learning through creative means. And
Mm.
there's mnemonics, there's ways of using words and
Listen, news, preaching to the
alliteration.
converted here. I'm inside, I'm just going, yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. So I think for me, this is co-creation, and I think what I've noticed, particularly in my research and when I've been embedding the framework and using it, is once students see themselves, as I said, as part of their learn, once they felt listened, heard,
Mm. Mm.
world is their oyster. They're going to show up for you,
Covered.
and
Yeah,
then they own their learning. That's where you
absolutely.
don't have to worry about using incentives or trying to buy people in to get
Mm.
in to do stuff. I remember the old EMA, educational maintenance grant schemes, and all of this that
Mhm.
they used to use to try and keep people in education. If people see that there's a place for them and that they
Yeah,
can benefit from it, you've got them. That's more
yeah,
valuable than any money. And that's just my
yeah.
own professional and personal experience.
Yeah, I want to go back to this again, the awarding gap, because I know that some people will hear about it if they've never heard about it before,
Mm.
or even if they have, and they'll go back to that deficit way of thinking in that, well, there must be something wrong with those students,
Yes,
right?
yes,
So how does your work challenge that narrative?
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
because people will be, and again, I think about there's many examples of this. So even in like in the criminal justice system, the
Mm.
fact that you've got more um, gosh, I think the last time I checked, it was like 51% of young people in the criminal justice system were from a racially marginalized background.
Mm.
Again, most people will probably be thinking, oh, well, it's because they commit more crime. So,
Yeah.
how does your work challenge those narratives?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I mean, definitely what we need to think about as part of those narratives is what exists is that deficit, that whole deficit model that you're referring to, Rebecca.
Mm,
And this deficit notion is often always, whether it's you use the criminal justice system as an example,
mm,
I'm in education. So there's often this take of blaming the victim
yeah.
for their repression or their issues. And I know victim is a very strong word, but to some extent, they are. You are a victim of the
Absolutely. Of
institutions of
racism?
oppression, of racism, and certain oppressions that exist, and those inequalities. So for me, what my work has done is really, yet again, coming back to that point of flattening the line where you have dialogue. Dialogue is really important because a dialogic, I guess, interaction is saying that your voice matters. We
Mm,
are interested in hearing what you've got to say. And the dialogue really, when you consider dialogue between um, facilitator, student, teacher, student, participant, you're really saying, I'm willing to learn from you, as
super
well as
important.
also
Yeah.
to share knowledge with you as well.
Yeah.
That has huge shifts in
Yeah.
the dynamic. I appreciate people are studying a course because they want to learn something. You are a professional, you are
Mm,
skilled, you're experienced, and you're
mm,
gifted. That's why you're there to teach those students, but also you have to be willing to learn and listen to who's in the room with you as well, because it's a part of a joint process of not necessarily transaction, but dialogue. And dialogue
I
flows. It's
agree.
about energy, you know? So, for example, a very quick way that people can do this is, as you know, with certain courses, people will teach a particular curriculum, which is, let's say we say, stays the same or stays static year in, year out as they teach. But
Mm.
you've got to be able to tweak that to the response, to be responsible and responsive to those who are then in the room. Do you
Yeah.
understand what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
So people who are in the room will bring a different take, a different perspective to what you're bringing. To me, I think that enriches your curriculum. If
Yeah.
set parameter of stuff that you're talking through, new perspectives on that, I think will help to shape how you
You know,
then develop that work and how
yeah.
that improves for future iterations as well going forward.
Yeah, I think with that, I think what many lecturers and educators struggle with is giving up a level of control
Mm.
because that involves you being vulnerable to a certain to a certain point and not and having to give a piece of yourself. And I think for some people that is absolutely terrifying because when we're delivering training, whether it's DEI training or anti-racism, that's what we're asking people to do is to
Mm.
be open, to be honest, to be humble, to allow yourself to be wrong, to self-reflect. And some people are absolutely terrified of that.
Mm.
What would you say to those people?
Yeah, again, it's a bit like what we said a bit earlier. I would encourage people to take the risk. Okay.
Mm,
Normally, and obviously, I would appreciate, I guess, given the work around compassion, if we're creating compassionate spaces and
mm,
learning environments, this should be a space where colleagues should be able to take risks and take
mm,
chances, right?
mm,
Um, and you know what? We're not going to beat people down if they make a mistake. You may
mm.
be held to account with maybe the language or things that may be used, but you know what? This is part of the learning experience. And the funny thing is, each and every day, whether it's within education or in training, we always expect, as employers, as business owners, we always expect people to take risks,
Yeah,
with our products or whatever they're engaging with what we put out there. So why should we be any different? We
yeah,
should be willing to also take the risk, and risk maybe getting burned or, thinking, okay, that wasn't
yeah.
right, but I'm gonna come back and do you know what? I'm better off for it because now
Right.
that's not acceptable. But now
Yeah,
this is I've got to do things differently. So
yeah,
I would say take the risk. And also you often will find when you do that, there'll be other people that will go, oh God, I feel the same way. Or
right.
I'm in the same position. And
Yeah.
that builds a more conducive learning environment in my experience. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes to all the above. Okay, let's switch to talking about code switching and assimilation, which is what, or covering, which is what a lot of Black and brown students feel they need to do for a form of survival. So they feel they need to hide a part of their
Yeah.
identity
Yeah.
in order to fit in with the majority culture. So, how what do you think are the consequences of doing that for racially marginalized students?
Well, actually, I mean, it's funny you asked that. A lot of research is coming out at the moment. There's hot off the press, fresh research that speaks to actually how code switching has a very adverse impact and effect on people's mental health and well-being,
Yeah.
particularly for students. So for those yet again who are listening, interested in this, I will
Mhm.
urge you to check out Dr. Nakasi Stoll, whose research was into the she did the Black well-being study, Black students' well-being study. That's from King's College, London. Really interesting research about this notion of how students of color
Mm.
often had to explain to their white counterparts, other students and lecturers, how they often had to exercise this sense of reimagining and reframing their identity in what they described as a white image, a white acceptable image in order to get on at
Wow.
university. Other studies by Sheffield Hallam University talks recently about the need for international students and the barriers around language, where students feel that if their language is not reflected in a way that's, culturally sensitive in the classroom. This narrow sense of English is the only way that we communicate. You're in England, this is the only way you're going to be assessed. You must write in English. This prevents a barrier for people speaking ideas into the classroom, and the whole idea of the death of ideas and the notion of
Yes.
ideas dying, those
Yeah.
ideas that couldn't have the chance to be breathed life into the classroom because of the fact that their language or their tongue had been denied. So there's a lot of research that speaks to that at the moment, which again, I will argue, translates to other contexts of learning and development. Yeah. So
And
there's also go
just,
on, go
what I
on.
said, I just want you to repeat the name of Dr.
Yeah,
Nakasi.
Dr. Nakasi Stoll, so Stoll from King's
Got it.
College
Yeah.
London. And a
Mm.
lot of my research, my framework has been informed by their
Mm.
research.
Yeah.
So at Sheffield Hallam, as I said, around deaf, they called it ideas dying as a
Ideas
result of code
dying.
switching. Now, the other kind of counterpart to that is this notion of students who also have to become invisible to
Mm-hmm.
succeed. And when we're talking about invisibility, we're talking about, look, I don't want to rock the boat.
Yeah.
I'm just going to show up, even if I got a grade that I put my heart and soul into to that assessment. I didn't get the outcome that I wanted. I'm not going to challenge this. Not going to rock the boat because it's just going to be more detrimental for me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's this other thing with code switching of where people actually, become, they want to avoid becoming hyper visible and be really
Yeah.
invisible, and they get often hidden. These are the students that often need the most help because even if
Mm.
they are struggling with the work, or even if they just feel that the learning, they're not it's just not necessarily a reflection of them but their environment, and they're not getting what needs to be processed so that they get on with their studies, they
Mm.
often are regressing and hiding, and they often are the most difficult to engage. They're often the ones that are
Mm.
often maybe showing up at classes as often, not because, yeah, again, there's a deficit or they don't understand. There are other challenges, but this idea of just becoming super invisible in the learning space, so that's something that's come up as well.
Oh.
Part of that, yeah. So there's these different real fresh research, and Dr. Deborah Husbands from Professor Deborah Husbands. She might smack me on the wrist that wrong, from the University of Westminster. She's done a lot of research recently around imposter syndrome and
Mm.
around psychology. So, we need to look at the research, see what it's
Mm.
saying. This is hot off the press in terms of
Mhm.
what's happening around this work. And obviously, I guess you get the consequences. Students come, it affects their mental health if they don't matter in the institution.
Mm.
They don't get the grades that they're
Mm.
supposed to get, which hampers social mobility, progression, in terms of employment, and they carry this stuff. This burden gets carried further through their careers.
Oh gosh, Kevin,
Not
as
great.
just yeah,
Yeah.
as you're speaking, I'm thinking back to my own university experiences. I mean, grade wise, I did okay. However, at points I was that silent student because I was
Mm,
surrounded. Firstly, you got the culture shock. I grew up in a
mm,
very multicultural environment, so to go to a primarily all-white university was shocking, and just it was just very different. But then when like you're new, you're growing up, you're new to this. I think even now, yes, there are conversations that are, I guess there are more conversations about racism that are taking place within society, but
mm.
still, I think there can be the tendency for Black and brown students to want to shut that out and not to believe that that stuff is really as bad as it is. And so you're just trying to function, trying to be a good student and make your way through, but you're kind of always meeting these invisible barriers, and you're quite confused because you're not sure what's going on here, and why actually are they not sitting by me, or why is it the lecturer said that to me, or why is I'm feeling this way, and it's very confusing, which I think is so sad, so very sad.
100%. It's disorientating, isn't it? Why would you want? You didn't come here to have to battle these things on all these levels. You came to learn something. You came to better yourself, and then you're finding, as you rightly said, these hidden barriers, these glass ceilings, these microaggressions, these
Yeah.
things in interactions with members of staff, or the way that people deal with you, that you just think, why am I encountering this? So, and to be honest with you, you're right. There are a lot of students that feel it but don't really want to be immersed in that. And why would you? Because it's very scary.
Yeah.
To go to a place of discomfort, particularly a place that you have no control over, where people effectively have, you know, your destiny in their hands, so to speak, around your marked work, how you're assessed, how well you get on. They
Yeah.
talk, I mean, this goes part and parcel with the other term used as the hidden curriculum. These are the kind of the rules that, you know, the rules of engagement that, you know, certain groups will be aware of, that not everyone's cognizant of. And yet again, this is where the framework that I've developed is about being conscious of these barriers and these
Yeah.
challenges. So I highlight a lot of, as I said, the research that I've mentioned as part of my disrupt the discourse framework, because that foregrounds the experience of the academy for a lot of students, so people are aware of what the realities are.
Okay, I'm gonna move this on, but this is also valuable, and I've made a note of these books, which I'll bring up again afterwards. But I want to move on to Lounge Academics, which is a
Sure.
creative space that
Yeah.
you've created. It's rooted in justice.
Mhm.
So why, firstly, describe this space, what it is, and why you felt the need to create it.
Do you know what, Rebecca? To be honest, yet again, comes back to me personally. I mean, Lounge Academics is really my personal vehicle. It's really the, if we look at dual identities, it's the complete opposite to my academic persona, to be honest with you. I'm sitting here right now in this interview as an academic, but I have a love for humor, for comedy, for performance. Um, and really, Lounge Academics embodies all of that. That's all the other sides to me that's quite dynamic, right? Quite creative in the way that we solve problems and we deliver workshops, the way that I engage with speaking with people. And really the platform, it's multifaceted. It's a speaker's platform. It's another platform for me to kind of speak my truth in a way that's quite humorous and fun. It's a way to engage with other creatives in the space. It's also a platform that enables people to reimagine learning in a creative way as well. And you know, one thing I didn't mention when you talked about some of the inequities and the inequalities that exist in terms of the barriers is actually the damage that the buildings can do to people as well. That not, and I just don't mean this symbolically around who buildings are associated with, but I mean in terms of how physical spaces are designed and built. Lecture theatres are often there's a lot of barriers. There's often rows of tables
Yeah,
before you even get to the lecturer or
yeah,
speak to them. There are
yeah.
all I mean, just in the way that things are designed, it's really fascinating to me.
Yeah,
The
restrictive.
environment is very restrictive in terms of the way that the environment is built. Whereas for me, Lounge Academics is often usually done in community spaces, often in very creative spaces like studios, environments where people can really relax. It's got hence Lounge Academics. It's
Yeah,
got
I
a
love
lounge
it.
feel to it, which is
Yeah.
very chilled. So it's really it keeps your rigor, it keeps your social and emotional intelligence in check, but it brings it to a space that's far more accessible and people are more likely to go. Because you got to realize sometimes when we talk about universities as well, some people, universities and education isn't for everyone.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, in that sense, in terms of higher education,
Yeah.
it's all good. And sometimes not everyone's going to be picking up an academic journal or a
Yeah.
chapter in a book to read. You know,
Yeah.
like we're on a podcast right now. There's other ways of sharing knowledge. And
Yeah.
that's the other thing about this. And it's about co-creation of knowledge, but in other ways as well.
Oh, I love that. And at the beginning of you describing that, you almost apologetically spoke about your enjoyment of it. But I think what my theory is. I think the reason why so many, because we hear this, right? Why are there so many Black people that are into sport or are into the creative arts or all these kind of physical or enjoyment filled type activities? I truly believe it's a way of dealing with trauma. I do, and I'm not saying that's the
Yeah.
reason you're doing it,
Yeah.
but I do. I feel like we have to have these outlets for these,
100%.
these daily microaggressions and macroaggressions, So I guess what I'm saying is, don't apologize. Like
Yeah, yeah.
you need the other side to you.
You do, and it's interesting because this is the thing when we're talking about this work, and when you enter certain spaces, this is around speaking with all with intention and with authenticity. Yeah,
Mm,
and we're complex human beings, man. There's more to us than our
mm,
profession. We are
yeah,
parents, we are partners.
yeah,
There's so many hobbies and interests that we have, and you're absolutely correct. But we're often, I think, and this isn't just reflective of necessarily ethnicity or gender or race, but I think generally as a people, these spaces beat it out of us. You're
yeah,
taught to leave these dynamic aspects of us outside, and it starts from childhood.
yeah.
That childhood energy that we've had running around, charged with ideas and imagination and
Mm,
trying
mm,
new things. We find gets once you hit the education system beaten out of you, man. You
yeah,
sit there, cross your legs.
yeah.
We all sit down, we put our hands on our lips to be silent, and we know there's rules around boundaries and stuff.
Yeah,
But also over time, you just find people lose themselves,
they're
Um,
dehumanized.
yeah, 100%.
Yeah,
But thank you for
yeah,
raising that, Rebecca. Yes.
yeah, yeah. All right, this is so interesting, but I'm going to kind of bring it towards the end, right? So,
Yeah.
again, when we were talking, you mentioned that you want your research to lead to consultancy and training opportunities. So, what kind of organizations do you think most need this work, and what does an ideal collaboration look like for you?
Ooh, nice question. I think for me, Rebecca, ultimately, where I would like this work to lead is for us to really think more openly and broadly around how we learn, right?
Mm,
So fundamentally, although it's starting in higher education in terms of my work, anyone who is in a training or facilitating capacity, who facilitates learning and development, HR, any departments where there's that angle to looking at how we train others. I
mm,
would hope that this is potentially a framework, another tool in a way to look at how you facilitate that learning that
mm,
goes beyond, like I said, death by PowerPoint and just sage on the stage. Yeah,
mm,
disrupting your environment, moving the tables, physically changing the environment,
mm,
looking at how you produce or set up your learning environment, how you produce learning materials, consider co-creation as part of that. Look at what people are accessing right now in terms of the culture, whether that's meme culture and how we use memes to translate learning and experience, like bringing humor,
mm,
bringing performative aspects of learning development, and looking at comedy, improv, looking at all these great facets that could really help
yeah,
to break the ice and create inclusive learning environments. So for me, I would like to really see people use the framework very loosely in that way so that they can
mm,
reimagine their learning. So that's the first part, I guess, as part of your question. And in terms of the collaborations for me, anyone who's willing to take a risk, really. So what I forgot to mention a bit earlier is that another aspect of my work is to get involved in knowledge exchange. And what that
mm,
basically means is where the institution works with community-based organizations, whether that's voluntary sector, third sector,
mm,
industry, in any
mm,
shape or form, to look at how you can share innovation and knowledge, really.
mm,
And for me, it's about sharing that knowledge with anyone who's willing to try it out, who is willing to use the research to inform how they may do stuff. Anything from even organizing a team meeting to a
mm.
training program, or looking at managing change over a course or period. So for me, open to speaking to colleagues. Some of the work that I've done using this has been with social work, with local authorities. I've also
Mm.
worked with artistic institutions as well. As part of that work to think about DEI related themes, as well as looking at just generally inclusive environments,
Yeah.
using digital co-creation.
And how do people get in touch with you?
I'm on LinkedIn. That's the best one for me. People will be inundated with posts from me, with an onslaught of posts on LinkedIn. So you can follow me on LinkedIn by Kevin J Brazant. Alternatively, my platform Lounge Academics. That's with a K.
Mm.
In the way it's spelled, you can find me on most social platforms from Instagram to LinkedIn yet again. So yeah, that's how people can get in touch with me.
Okay, so finally, if you could leave the listeners especially those in leadership roles, with one key takeaway to help them to disrupt inequity within their organizations, what would that be?
I would say, based on our conversation, let go, right? Let go, let go, and let go. Sit in the uncertainty. I get it's hard, I get it's difficult, but take a risk, okay? And you can start these risks off small. You know, it doesn't have to be some big, huge, monumental shift, you know. You can start with maybe, do you know what, at the beginning of my session, where normally I would start with feedback from colleagues and hearing, you know, what they felt about the session, start off with what their expectations are. You know, bring past participants' voices into the room. Use your evaluations from previous sessions to come in and say, this is the feedback that we had so far from our previous sessions. This is what we would hope to say that we've tried to improve on this aspect of our work. I want you to hold us to account on this, yeah, and check in with us and see how well we've done, and feel if that mirrors their experiences or if we've tackled that from our last kind of so really, you know, and it does bring discomfort, but sit in it anyway.
Oh, love it. So your leaving message is let go, and I like the simplicity and complexity of that all at the same time. I'm just going to repeat some of the points of research that you mentioned. So Harry Gardner's is multiple intelligences.
Yeah, Howard Gardner. Yeah, on multiple.
Yeah, got that.
You could put in a Google for that, yeah, and that will come up. Yeah.
And then Dr. Nakasi Stoll's Black Student Wellbeing Study.
Yeah.
And Dr. Stoll is from King's College London. Yeah. And then you mentioned Sheffield Hallam's University's Ideas Dying.
Yes, yeah. So if you put in notions of ideas dying and
notions of
and silence in academic talk. That was their research that they did around that, particularly around the barriers around language for students.
And finally, you mentioned Dr. Deborah Husband of the University of Westminster, the imposter syndrome.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah.
From psychology, educational psychology lens,
Fantastic. So there is no excuse. You've given them all the goods, which is why I wanted to speak to you, Kevin. Thank you so much for your research and for speaking to me today. You know, may many places, not just in higher education, get to know your work and utilize it, because it's needed. It's needed. So I wish you all the best. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for inviting me into your platform. Thank you.